Hi, Taylor T. Carlson, and we've arrived at the end of 2020. Finally, I'm going to look at my picks for the top 5 albums of the year, as well as some honorable mentions, and a few other categories as well. Again, these are just my personal selections. This is by no means the definitive list of what the best things in the year were. Just my personal picks. I hope you agree with a few of these, and just a heads up before we get on with it, I do have an Iron Maiden shirt on. My girlfriend got me this for Christmas. Very cool shirt. Iron Maiden does not show up on this list. All they put out this last year, to my knowledge, was a live album, which was actually very good. We might get to that in the honorable mentions, but anyway, moving on down the list, let's get started. Gonna get the biggest disappointment of the year out of the way first. That, of course, would be that terrible vinyl reissue of the first Extreme album, which omits the song Play With Me. I don't know what they were thinking when they put that out. I'm not going to go into an angry rant here because I have a separate video where I do just that. Click the link above and you'll be seeing that at your earliest convenience. Moving on with more positives, the best reissue of a classic album this year was the Record Store Day reissue of Skid Row, Slave to the Grind, featuring 2 LPs, with the end of the album including some bonus stuff. I mean, honestly, I haven't had a chance to pick this up yet. It's such a cool release, but the problem is, because it's a Record Store Day release, it was so limited edition that all the scalpers snatched them up, and now they're selling for like $100 a piece. I want one of these for myself, but I'm not going to go out and pay that kind of money for one. These Record Store Day scalpers really need to be stopped, and this has just reached ridiculous heights. I might do a video covering that later on. Moving on, the best live release of the year, we're looking at some vintage, previously unreleased live material with this Cheap Trick Out to Get You release that came out on vinyl for Record Store Day this year. These are some early concerts when Cheap Trick was just first starting out, done at the Whiskey A Go-Go when they were young and hungry. I love seeing bands like this in their infancy on these releases of vintage material. Now, before I get on with my top 5, I'm going to do a few honorable mentions. I just mentioned Iron Maiden. They put out a live album this year that was filmed in Mexico City in late 2019. Triple vinyl set with a ton of tracks spanning their whole career. Great release. Iron Maiden has way too many live albums, but if you like the band and you like the music, who are you to complain? It's a good one, and that's all I have to say about that. Another great honorable mention, Ozzy Osbourne, Ordinary Man. Ozzy hasn't put out a studio album in 10 years unless you count that Black Sabbath semi-reunion album he did a few years ago, and even that had, a different drummer on it, so it wasn't totally a reunion, and that was still like 7 or 8 years ago. This album is probably the best of the modern Ozzy albums, probably the best one he's put out since No More Tears, if you ask me. Some solid tunes, a little more produced, a little more in the way of guests on the album. I mean, he even does a song with Post Malone on here and a song with Elton John. Surprisingly, the songs are actually pretty good. Maybe a little more produced and slick than I like from my Ozzy material, but pretty damn solid. I mean, the guy's in his 70s now, and I hope he's going to be with us for a while still, although I do think it would be good for him to retire so he can spend his autumn years with his family and friends. That said, no denying this is a good release. Another great one. Striper, Even the Devil Believes. The Yellow and Black Attack, they're back doing what they do best, and Striper remains one of my favorite classic hard rock and heavy metal bands. Guitarist Oz Fox actually lives out here in Las Vegas. I've met him several times over the years. Very good guy. He's been dealing with some medical issues the last few years, and I wish him nothing but the speediest of recovery so he can get back on stage and do what he does best. Last of the honorable mentions, Anvil, Legal at Last. Great Canadian classic hard rock band. They're better known for the documentary that came out in the mid-2000s than they are their actual music, but they've been doing what they've been doing for 40 plus years, and they're still doing it well. This is another great album. These guys have a little bit of a sense of humor about them, but, despite that, they still rock hard. I mean, it only takes one watch of the documentary to see just how humorous these guys can be, including one of the objects that singer-guitarist Lips uses as a guitar slide. If you haven't seen the movie, I'm not going to spoil it. It's also probably inappropriate to mention it in this video. That's all I'm going to say. Anvil, great band. One thing I wanted to add about them, I saw them live in 2016 out here in Vegas. Very first song they were doing, Lips jumps out in the middle of the crowd and just starts playing his guitar surrounded by people. Never seen anyone do anything like that. Haven't seen anyone do it since. Now I've got the list here. We're going on to the top 5 albums of the year as I've chosen. Now, there were a lot of releases this year despite the fact that it's been a screwy year. I didn't go to any concerts this last year because there really haven't been any. There were a few at the beginning of the year, which unfortunately I didn't get to see, and since then it's just been dead in the water. But we got some pretty solid studio releases from bands, so I'm going to go down and name off my top 5. At number 5 in my top 5 albums of the year, LA Guns, Renegades. This is not the Tracy Guns, Phil Lewis LA Guns. It's the drummer Steve Riley's version, which has Scotty Griffin, a former bassist from the band, on guitar, and then it also has Kurt Froelich on vocals. He used to live out here in Vegas for years, and I used to see him all the time with his old band, the Underground Rebels, and he used to perform with a group I heard called the Sin City Sinners. This is not what you'd expect from an LA Guns album. It's almost more of a power pop album. It's really more like a lost Sin City Sinners album than an LA Guns album, but if you're like me and you're familiar with a lot of that stuff out here in Vegas, that's not a bad thing. There are some great cuts on here. Scotty Griffin, of course, he lives out here in Vegas. Met him many times, seen him perform with a bunch of bands, both as a bassist and a guitar, and even occasionally as a singer. Sin City Sinners have a side project called Sin City Rejects where he actually sings. I love Scotty Griffin, and this album sums that up beautifully. Not to mention Kurt Froelich's a killer singer, and I'm glad to see Steve Riley behind the skins doing what he does best. Going down to number 4. AC/DC, Power Up. I thought AC/DC was done. Malcolm Young died. Brian Johnson had to supposedly retire for health reasons. They had to bring in Malcolm Young's nephew, Stevie, to fill in a lot of the old tour dates. But, they got Stevie there still, and they got Brian Johnson to come back, and they recorded a new album that sounds just like anything they recorded back in the 1980s. AC/DC are firm believers in the philosophy of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and Power Up sums up that beautifully. I haven't got this little poster here because I bought it from the local Zia record store, and they were giving those out if you bought the album. I think that was like an indie record store thing with them handing those out. We're going to move on now to number 3, and that's Black Swan. Another super group in the world of music. We're seeing a lot more of these with like the classic metal guys, but the real highlight of this group is that they feature vocalist Robin McAuley. Robin McAuley, best known, of course, for playing with Michael Schenker in the McAuley-Schenker group, but it's a who's who of artists here. A little more of a modern edge, but still got that classic sound. Robin McAuley, one of my favorite singers of all time. The guy's got one of the most distinctive voices I've ever heard, and even well into his 60s, the guy's still doing what he does best. As soon as all these shenanigans in the world are done with, I really want to see him on stage again. He actually sings here in town in a show called Raiding the Rockfall, which I hope will resume because he's the proverbial singer that could sing the phone book, and it would be great. Moving down the list, number 2 on our list, Armored Saint, Punching the Sky. Armored Saint, of course, featuring vocalist John Bush, also known for a stint that he had in Anthrax, and these days, since like the late 80s, since the death of Dave Pritchard on guitar, they've had guitarist Jeff Duncan, who largely picked up the slack after Dave Pritchard had died. Jeff Duncan, another Las Vegas resident these days, killer guitarist. This release is just Armored Saint doing what they do best. I bought the purple vinyl they put out. It came with this poster here, which is a part of my new set. I adore Armored Saint. I really want to add more of their stuff to my collection, and I'm glad to say that their latest release is a pretty diverse affair, mixing old and new sounds. Does not disappoint in the least. And now my pick for the number 1 rock or metal album of 2020. Blue Oyster Cult, The Symbol Remains. Blue Oyster Cult, everybody knows them back in the 70s for the classic hit song Don't Fear the Reaper, as well as songs like Godzilla and Burnin' For You. Blue Oyster Cult, even though they've been together performing with a few fluctuating lineups, they've always included vocalist, guitarist Eric Bloom and Buck Dharma. Those guys are still active. And this album ends up being where Richie Castellano, who's largely been the unsung hero of the band in recent years, gets to step up to the plate and show off his stuff. It's an album with a great mix of sounds. I mean, there's songs that sound like they could have come out in the 70s or the 80s. There's songs that harken back to their more commercial material. There's songs that harken back to their deep tracks and more progressive and heavy material. This album literally does it all. It's the first Blue Oyster Cult studio album in 20 years. Despite that, it was worth the wait. These guys have delivered what I believe is their best album since 1981's Fire of Unknown Origin, and that's no small claim. And that brings us to the end of this list. Hopefully 2021 will be better, and hopefully we'll actually start getting concerts again. What was your favorite album of 2020? What was your biggest disappointment? Comment down below and let me know what you think. Also subscribe to my channel for more content because I'm always posting new videos, and give this one a like if you found it helpful or interesting. I'm Taylor T. Carlson, and here's to rocking out in 2021.